Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture video for week 4, which is juvenile court procedures. So, brief recap, what we've talked about previously that are kind of important dates. Just a reminder, 1899, Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. This is the Juvenile Court Act of 1899, where the big pieces and takeaways to make sure that we're on the same page is kids aren't mini adults and they need to be treated differently, and that means the paternalistic approach to what is in the quote best interest of the child. And we're going to come back to this concept several times, but it's important to note like those are the big pieces for that. So parents patriae, which is that second part, as well as the 4 rules and motivations, is the 2 sets of 4 things behind this. So, and then the other big thing is 1967 in Galt, where due process and an attorney is ensured for juveniles. Like I said, that's the very quick, brief recap. So, let's actually get into new information. And not that it's necessarily new information, but hopefully new to you or helping flesh something out. So, we have structure and organization. So, very specifically, to address the unique needs of young offenders, the rules, roles, and structures of our justice system are slightly modified. Another way to say it is it's slightly altered because technically they are still doing the roles that they would do in the adult system. The difference is the full list of responsibilities and some of the specific verbiage changes between those groups. So we have 3 main areas. We talk about the judges, the probation officers, and other personnel. And we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So judges are pretty much exactly what they sound like. If you are any bit familiar with the criminal justice system, judges should be something that's well known and established. The judges are the ones who sit over on a court case, and they act as the ensure that all the rules are followed, and usually has some kind of say in the sentencing and whatnot. Here in the juvenile court system, they adjudicate cases, which means they, sit and listen and oversee cases. But they also oversee rehabilitation processes. So when we say they oversee rehabilitation processes, they are the ones that make sure that the juvenile, once sentenced, is going through the rehabilitation. They are more active than a traditional judge. When a traditional judge assigns an adult offender to a charge, the judge doesn't continue to follow up with them. That's the Department of Corrections that maintains that. The judges here in the juvenile system keep as active as they possibly can, which changes from judge to judge. Something that's important here, specifically in juvenile court, is that juvenile judges are trained not just in traditional law, but they also tend to have, as a requirement, they need to have a background in child psychology and or child development. Because again, remember what we said earlier, children are not mini adults. They have a whole host of other things that we need to consider. And so for those purposes, the judges need to have some kind of background in that. The other reason that this is super important is because in the juvenile justice system, judges play a major role in the system. Judges in the traditional adult system play a significant role, but here in the juvenile justice system, they have more control and more of a area that they impact. Probation officers, well, much like they do in adult cases, they act as supervisors and caseworkers for their offenders. So yeah, in the adult and the juvenile system, a probation officer will make sure that you're abiding by the rules of your probation and making sure that things are taken care of as they should be. However, in the juvenile system, they're often involved in creating comprehensive rehabilitation plans that address education, family dynamics, and social behaviors. So their job is not just to monitor the juvenile's progress, but they're integral in connecting with community resources and support services. And I do want to note, these are things that they do in the juvenile justice system, or they should be doing in the juvenile justice system, that most experts will also say they should be doing in the adult system. And in some places, in some cases, they do. This gets complicated when we talk about individual states' rights, but it is important to note that probation officers, there is a goal towards making sure that there are connections. And then other personnel, we have social workers, psychologists, and gals. So social workers and psychologists are pretty straightforward and obvious in what the goal and the conversation around them. So in the adult system, if an individual does have a social worker or a psychologist as someone who has regularly seen them before they've been in court, they will definitely have a role. But in the juvenile justice system, there's almost always somebody that is involved, whether they've had previous engagement or not. Gals, on the other hand, guardian ad litems, which is Latin, are individuals appointed by the court, and they represent the best interests of a child during legal proceedings, especially cases involving abuse, neglect, custody, disputes, and other child welfare situations. So these aren't quite lawyers. These are special individuals who are designated by the court to act essentially as a victim advocate for the child in serious cases where the child may not be appropriate for them to be available in court and things of that nature. So, yeah, hopefully that's a new thing you learned. So, in going with an overview of everything, I want to talk about the type of facilities that we tend to have. And so, I broke them down here into detention centers, courtrooms, and community-based facilities. And honestly, it's kind of straightforward, only because detention centers are what people traditionally think of when we say juvenile detention. When we say that a kid is a juvenile delinquent, most people imagine that they go to some kind of juvenile detention facility. That's this first one right there. The courtrooms, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, is a place where, trials are heard. We need to talk about the types of facilities in the juvenile court system. And then there's community-based facilities, and we're going to talk about those last. So let's talk about courtrooms first. So courtrooms in the juvenile justice system tend to be smaller and less formal than adult courtrooms. If you've ever seen the cliche adult courtrooms from, pick your movie or TV drama that has to do with a courtroom, those are the traditional adult courtrooms. But in a lot of places, in a lot of jurisdictions, juvenile justice courtrooms tend to be smaller. They tend to be more intimate. They're designed that way because they've found psychology-wise, if you make it less imposing, kids are more open to discussion and things of that nature. And so that helps build that proper rapport that's needed in the system. So just going to mention that. Like I said, one thing I have is the layout may encourage interaction rather than conflict. That's the purpose behind the less formal, smaller courtrooms. As far as detention centers go, I have this direct quote because it's important to note that this is the design around it and the intention around it. I would argue that it's not always, and this is a problematic thing, especially if you look into the history of juvenile detention centers, but juvenile detention centers are, quote, structured to provide a more rehabilitative environment, often include classrooms, therapy rooms, and recreation spaces that help maintain a normal routine, end quote. So, detention centers are, again, things that most people visualize. And yeah, they are meant to be little jails to hold juvenile delinquents. There are issues with these, especially when we consider they claim to be towards this, but several independent research has shown that it's not. There's a whole host of problems with juvenile detention not working. A majority of juvenile detention centers are actually private, not publicly funded, which is another problematic issue. Detention centers are difficult to discuss, partly because they are juvenile. They're also very private, and they don't have to necessarily share all the same information publicly as other systems. It's complicated. So what is important to remember about detention centers is that they are designed to house juvenile delinquents. They are there as their punishment. This is just like prison, but for children. And so yes, they try to include classrooms and things like that so that it seems more like a regular situation, but it is clearly not. And community-based facilities, we're going to talk about this more later in the semester in this class, but community-based facilities are things like group homes. And I want to emphasize community-based means that these are, again, they're not necessarily public, but they're not private. These are things that are run by the community, out in the community. They're supported by the community. They're not something that's run exclusively by the prison. They're not exclusively run by the sheriff. These are things that are supposed to be alternatives to incarceration. A detention center is incarceration. Community-based facilities tend to be alternatives to that, which is why we put group homes in here. All right. So let's talk about something weird. Juvenile court jurisdiction. And in case you don't know, jurisdiction, in very short, easy terms, is the boundary lines. Jurisdiction is the who has control over what. And so we're going to talk about what the juvenile court has the jurisdiction or the legal authority to do and what they oversee. So, right off the bat, it's important to note that the jurisdiction for juvenile courts, they do overhear delinquency case. So, delinquency cases we've already talked about. Delinquency is any activity that would be considered a criminal. If it was conducted by an adult, it's just simply conducted by a child. So it's anything from minor theft to more severe offenses. Delinquency cases, the whole gamut of crimes. So they hear delinquency cases. And they also hear status offense cases. So where the court intervenes to address underlying issues. And again, we talked about status offenses. These are things that are illegal only because a kid committed it. So things like truancy, not going to school, things like running away, things like being out after curfew, those are all status offenses. So clearly they hear those two types of cases. Now, this third one is very specific, and I want to mention. In some states, in some individual state jurisdictions, they might have a separate family court from juvenile court. If they do not, they all fall under juvenile court. Even in places where there is a family court and a juvenile court, typically the judges that listen to family court things are also juvenile judges. So there is some crossover, there is some connection. So it's important to note that when we talk about this, these are two separate but closely tied things, and for our purposes, it's important to note that juvenile courts can hear dependency cases. And dependency cases is when the parent or guardian are accused of neglect, abuse, or are unable to care for the child. The court will step in, and it is a juvenile court hearing. It's a dependency case. This is why I said in some jurisdictions where they have family court, which would hear dependency cases, those judges are also tend to be juvenile judges because they have that background in child psychology, and their goal is to work in the best interest of the child. So, of course, they hear dependency cases. But again, I want to emphasize, because some places have family court and other places do not have a separate family court. This is the important piece. This is the takeaway. These are the 3 types of cases that a juvenile court will hear. And even within that, they have, certain authority. They have legal authority to do the following things. They can order rehabilitation programs. This can be things like drug treatment for a drug potential addiction. This can be counseling for mental health services. And this can even be community service. They're the ones that order the program for the juvenile once they've been in trouble. They're also the ones who decide placement. This is where they decide, does the individual child, does the juvenile return to the family? Do they need to be placed in foster care for their own safety? Or do they need to be placed in juvenile detention, which we're going to talk about separately in a minute? Obviously, if they aren't getting placed but they are being released, they are able to impose conditions for probation. So again, I've said this before, but if you've taken one of our other criminal justice classes, you should be familiar that probation comes with rules. And so the juvenile court judge, they are the ones that set the rules for probation for their juvenile offenders. This can be things like setting a different curfew. They can be ensuring and verifying that you are attending school. And they can also verify how regular check-ins need to be, if they're once a day, if they're twice a day, things like that. And then, of course, last but not least, they can set preventative measures. And preventative measures are exactly what they sound like. They're any type of program or design that's meant to prevent future criminal involvement. So they can set certain things in place to be like, okay, well, you have to attend this education course that is meant to prevent future criminal involvement. That is the juvenile court's legal right to do to a minor who has been found guilty of any offense. Okay? This is what they have the legal authority to do. Order the rehabilitation program, decide where someone is placed, impose conditions for their probation, and set any preventative measures necessary. They are allowed to do that. All right. So let's talk briefly about the key principles of juvenile courts. Because we just talked about what they can do. We just talked about their jurisdiction. We talked about their limits of where they can go. So we need to talk about some of the key principles behind juvenile courts. In other words, what exactly are they pushing for? And that's the presumption of rehabilitation, the best interest of the child, and procedural fairness. Presumption of rehabilitation is that every child, every offender has the capability to change. In the juvenile court system, one of the key principles is that everyone is capable of change. Everyone is capable of going through rehabilitation and coming out the other end. This is one of those key principles. These are one of those important things. This means that no matter how bad a crime was, a juvenile, a child, somebody under the legal age, has the chance to change in their life. And this is why we see even juveniles who commit murder, they don't get life without parole. They may get life, but they always have the option to apply for parole because there's the presumption that they can be rehabilitated at some point in their life. That's an important distinction between juvenile and adult systems. The adult system does not have the presumption of rehabilitation. It's a goal that we try to rehabilitate everyone, but that is not a key principle of it. That is something that is juvenile justice focused. So the presumption of rehabilitation, everyone is capable of change. Everyone is capable of rehabilitating, so we don't want to take that opportunity away. The second principle is straightforward, and I want to put quotes around it because it gets fuzzy. But the best interest of the child. I'm phrasing this very carefully. There are definitely cases where a court acted in what they said was the best interest of the child, and it in fact was not. I do not want to take that away. I definitely want to validate that that happens. However, there are some flaws with it, and one of those flaws is to act in the best interest of the child, they tend to work with the information they have available. Which means if they don't have the full picture or they have a skewed sense of information, that won't line up properly. And yes, that is an issue. And to say that just because this is a key principle doesn't mean that the system is wrong, that's the wrong approach. There is still flaws in our system. There's major flaws in the system. But it is important to note that one of the principles behind juvenile courts is they try to act in the best interest of the child. And there's a tiny part of me that wants to believe that most places do actually do that. And you can call me a little delusional for that, but that's fair. But it is important to note that this is one of those things that is stated, is written down, and one of the things that a lot of people go into believing is true. So that's why I hold off hope that it is followed. It's just a few people who are absolutely terrible that ruin it for the rest of everyone. And then the third and final principle of not the only principles, but the final key principle of juvenile courts is procedural fairness. And for the most part, there should be an asterisk on this because it also is in the adult system, but even in both systems, this isn't necessarily always true. Procedural fairness is that everybody gets the same opportunities, the same rights as everybody else, things like that. But I think most people nowadays definitely notice that people with more money tend to have more procedural fairness in court than those who don't. Also, your legal status here may or may not preclude some kind of procedural fairness that you're supposed to be given. The less I talk about it, the better, because the less depressed I get. But it is important to note that one of the principles of juvenile courts is to try and ensure that procedural fairness is maintained. And so one thing that I do want to mention briefly that isn't its own PowerPoint slide, but something I think is important to note is that within the juvenile court system, there is still issues of overcrowding in private facilities, things like that. But within the juvenile system itself, there is a unique problem that adult systems are now kind of experiencing that technically we've always experienced, but we didn't know it until now. And so very specifically, it's the need for specialized training. Dealing with kids, it may seem like one of those, well, anyone can do it because anyone can be a parent and all that. No, not quite. Not anybody can. Well, anybody can be a parent, but not everybody should be. But that's another conversation for another day. Dealing with kids, especially those with behavioral issues, requires specialized training. Dealing with people who have serious health conditions requires special training. Dealing with people with mental health disorders requires special training. And that is something that's severely lacking in all levels right now, is the specialized training. Because it's expensive, it's time consuming, and this leads to a larger problem within the system. So take that as you will. Fun fact or not fun fact. So I want to talk a little bit more about juvenile probation because I brought it up and I just, I thought you need to know a little bit more. So for juvenile probation, the job of the juvenile probation officer is to provide supervision, guidance, and support, which we said before. So that's going over the same things. But I did want to mention that the juvenile probation officer, the juvenile probation officer wants to make sure that they're, number one, promoting behavioral changes. And when we say promoting behavioral changes, we're talking about positive behavioral changes. The whole point of probation and parole and any type of rehabilitation is for positive change, not negative change. So we promote positive behavioral changes, and one of these things that specifically with juveniles that tends to be taught here is understanding the consequences of actions. I know if anybody has kids, you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Everyone teaches their kids the consequence of their actions. Not always, and this is one of those problems, and so it's important to help juvenile delinquents understand and learn how consequences happen and how to, properly deal with things, because one of the things that juvenile probation also does has to ensure the public safety, the community's safety. And so, unfortunately, they have to balance their supervision and support for their juvenile with intervention when necessary. They need to make sure that the community feels safe with the child back in it, even if they committed a crime. One of the big goals, obviously, is to prevent recidivism. And if we haven't heard this term before, recidivism is the act of recommitting a crime. So recidivism rate is the reoffending rate. That's the easy way to remember it. So to prevent recidivism, we want to make sure as probation that we want to equip youth with the tools to make lasting changes in their behavior. And how this tends to look is continuous support and monitoring, access to educational programs and vocational training that lead to better job opportunities. Because we know, scientifically, we know that success in school and success in a job, especially a career, are great deterrents from criminal behavior. People who are happy and stable in a job tend to commit crime less. And then last but certainly not least, a juvenile probation needs to make sure that it is tailored to the developmental needs of the individual child. This means it's individualized programming and understanding the appropriate measures for that juvenile. We want to make sure that it's not something that's disconnected. We want to make sure that it's understood and that it's easily accessible, it's easily understandable, and the point is to rehabilitate, re-release them back to normal society, but with more positive behavioral changes. And much like in adult probation, there are terms of supervision. So there are rules that juveniles have to follow. Like any adult who would be on probation, they have to follow certain rules. There's also things like mandatory counseling, specifically to address behavioral issues, mental health concerns, and any potential substance abuse. I know it's weird to say because we're talking juveniles, but it is important to note that there are kids out there who are on several illegal illicit drugs. There are kids who are under the age of 18 who are seriously addicted to drinking and gambling. There are kids that are doing the things that adults do as well. And that's important to note. So counseling is an important step in their rehabilitation. And then last but certainly not least, almost always a condition of some type of probation tends to be community service, because it shows that you are willing to give back to the community and you want to make it better. So that's the whole reason behind community service. So our juvenile probation officer, they have certain responsibilities. We can break it down to three simple ones: enforcement, guidance, support. Enforcement is ensuring that the child follows the rules. Guidance is that they act as a mentor and help set good goals. And support is obviously help to create a comprehensive support network in the child's life. And I want to emphasize that last one in particular. Not that the other ones aren't important. Enforcement makes sense. That's pretty much the most basic policing criminal justice thing is enforcement is one big thing. Guidance makes sense for a probation officer because, yeah, you're trying to make sure that they become a fully functioning member of society. But this support part, this is the part that people tend not to know initially, and it's something that a lot of them learn as they go into that career. The goal, one of the responsibilities of an officer, whether it's a juvenile probation officer or an adult probation officer, is to work on this support, trying to help build a support network. We know that people, especially with dependency issues, mental health issues, there's triggers. There's triggers that can set people off, and you want to make sure that they have a support system so that when what's currently here is not there, when the officer is not overlooking them and guiding them, that they'll make good decisions because they have a network there to help them. So that is an important aspect. And very specifically, not just probation, but the whole of criminal justice. There is a push, and this I can say is actually from people in the field have talked about this. There is a need for empathy at all levels of criminal justice. I've had conversations with people who work within the prison system, people who work in the county, who work in policing, who work in private security, who work in victim services. Across the board, one of the biggest things they say, and again, courtroom, in facilities, in the community at large, there needs to be a better push for empathy. Understanding how somebody could be there, understanding what they're going through, because that is a big issue. And so there is a push towards understanding empathy. And empathy goes a long way for making sure that that support is comprehensive. Understanding what someone is going through helps make sure that that support system will be successful. I do also want to state just real quickly, it's hard to measure success for programs, especially for juveniles, because it takes years to see the results. So if you have a question of how do we know that these programs work, well, because we've been studying them for years, and some of them we have lots of data, others we don't have nearly as much. But we do know one thing: empathy is important. So let's talk about juvenile detention, because we've kind of, tickled on it, but we haven't gone really deep into it. And so juvenile detention, while the primary emphasis is rehabilitation in juvenile justice, juvenile detention is a role. It's not the default decision, at least not anymore. Sometimes it can be, but it shouldn't be. But if we are going to use juvenile detention, there are certain criteria that need to be met to ensure that detention is the correct decision. And the criteria that they use to look at are the following. They look at the severity of alleged offense. So obviously, if the offense is, petty theft, things like that, it's not as severe that it should necessitate a petty theft is not a serious enough crime that a child should be sent to juvenile detention. A child beats up somebody and puts them in the hospital, yes, that's severe enough that would qualify. Another criteria that is looked at is the juvenile's past delinquency record. And this one kind of makes sense as well. If it's a first-time offender, do they necessarily need to be locked up? Probably not. If it's somebody who's repeatedly committed the offenses and has never spent time in there, yeah, we're probably going to put them there because clearly whatever it was that they were doing was not working. So with the severity of alleged offense, we also look at the circumstances of the offense. And what we would call these are mitigating circumstances. These are things that can mitigate or aggravate a situation. Mitigate is things that make it less. Aggravate are things that make it worse. So we want to look at certain details of the alleged offense. If it's petty theft, but they were brandishing a weapon like a knife, well, that's a circumstance to that offense that might make petty theft something worthy of juvenile detention. See how that works? Often, the question of did it involve violence is the big thing for the circumstance of the offense. If the offense is not necessarily a violent offense, but the individual who was involved did commit violence or had violence with it, that tends to be an aggravating circumstance that would make it more serious, something that'd be worthy of juvenile detention. And then, believe it or not, the current living situation and support system for the juvenile plays a role. If the living situation is bad and is part of the reason why they are getting into trouble, then yeah, you're going to see the juvenile detention become a very sought-after sentencing feature for a judge. Because clearly the home life is not good and it's not providing proper stability for the juvenile to not recidivate. And then, yeah, the support system. Do they have people there, or are they really on their own? It should also be noted, we also use those risk assessment tools and measures that we talked about previously last week. We want to look at those because those might also give us some specific details of what we want to look for in juvenile detention. I do want to mention there are alternatives to juvenile detention. We already talked a little bit about it previously when we talked about, it's already that far back. Yeah, community-based facilities. Things like group homes. We also, as another alternative, there's home confinement with electronics monitoring. So, the typical ankle monitor type situation. Those are all possibilities. All right. Now, we're getting into our last two slides and the last two things that we need to talk about. And it's really just talking about the structure of the adjudication hearing, which is the trial, and the disposition hearing, the sentencing. So this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to tell you right now, not a whole lot different than what I wrote on here. So the adjudication hearing, which is the trial, is that once a juvenile is charged, a petition outlining the alleged offenses is filed, and then we have a hearing. And during the hearing, just like a regular court case, prosecution and defense presents witnesses, evidence, make legal arguments, that typical thing. And of course, as we said previously, because of GALT and whatnot, that juveniles are entitled to legal representation. It is important to note, not always, but in some cases, the parents and guardians are also involved in the hearing itself. Not that they can't be present, but actively part of the hearing. There are certain circumstances where that may be necessary. One big important thing that I like to say about juvenile justice that a lot of people don't really, either they don't know or they never thought about it, is that there is no jury in a juvenile court procession. There is no jury in an adjudication hearing. It is just the judge. In juvenile justice, there is not a jury of their peers. My favorite thing to say is, could you imagine a 12-year-old being on trial and having to find 12 12-year-olds to make a decision on whether or not they're guilty? I would not trust 12-year-olds to make a decision about anyone. So, yeah, for the most part, there is no jury in a juvenile hearing. It is just the judge. If it gets transferred to adult court, then they might have a jury with traditional adult jurors, but that's a different thing. Within the juvenile justice system, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. This is one of the highest standards of proof in the court system, and it is required for all juvenile hearings. The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's an important aspect to keep in mind. And then, last but not least, the adjudication of the trial is designed to balance formality with developmental needs. As we said before, they generally tend to be less formal. A good example would be, how do you explain to a 13-year-old what they did was terribly wrong? Do you use big, fancy legal jargon that they don't understand? Or do you have a conversation and say, yeah, what you did was really screwed up, and this is the fallout, and you need to do this? You explain it in simpler terms. So they want to balance the formality of court with the needs of what the child is, especially when you consider there are some kids who are 8 years old that fall into the system. So that's the adjudication hearing. Then we have the disposition hearing. This is the sentencing. And so after a juvenile is found responsible for the offense, they're found guilty, the decision of appropriate course of action for the juvenile in the community is made. And so the court considers reports and recommendations from probation officers, social workers, and sometimes mental health professionals who have assessed the juvenile's behavior, background, and needs. For the most part, they get input from experts who have worked with the kid before. I do want to note, this is something that in some adult cases is a thing, and it's kind of pushed for a lot of times, but also we have it in juvenile justice. Sometimes family members in the juvenile may have the chance to speak up on their own behalf. But at the end of the day, the judge makes the final call. The judge is the person who is the jury. They make the call, they choose the sentencing, they enact it. So it's important to note, while the adult and juvenile systems are very similar, one big difference in their court proceedings is, other than the phrasings and the words, the adult system has a jury, and the juvenile system has no jury, but has a judge that makes all the calls. And it tends to be less formal. And I do want to say, while they make the final call, there are some factors that judges might consider when deciding sentencing. And these are things like the juvenile's age, any prior record they may have, and the effectiveness of any previous interventions that the juvenile may or may not have had. And with that, that's it. That's week 4's PowerPoint. Like I said, we talked about the court system, we talked about some of the key players in the court system, and we talked about the way it works. If you have any questions, please, as always, feel free to reach out and email me. I'd be glad to answer those questions. But thank you very much. Good luck on Quiz 3. Remember, next week will be the midterm exam, and it'll cover everything from this week back. Nothing from next week. This week back. So everything from this lecture and everything from the first 3. Alrighty. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video.